This podcast is sponsored by Action Steel.
A lot of us at harvest, when pressure's on and we're trying to get more harvest hours in a day, more grain in per day, if we're limited by a grain moisture, we go and look at, well, I'll get a contract harvester in, or I'll buy a bigger header next year, I'll go to a second or a third header next year. If we could manage moisture in grain, do it with less headers because we get more hours in a day. So we can start harvest a few hours earlier or run it a few hours later, or those overcast days where the moisture is just sitting 1% above our deliverable. What if we could run our headers on those days and not have as much capital tied up in harvest equipment and actually use aeration cooling to blend moisture in storage? So then all of a sudden we get grain storage paying itself with harvest logistics.
Welcome back to Shared Ag Solutions by BCG. I'm Janine Batters, and in this episode, we're going to be speaking with Chris Warrick, who is a grain storage expert. But we're not going to be speaking with Chris about weevils. We're going to be speaking with him about grain storage economics. So welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Janine. Great to be here. And just for clarity, I think expert's a little bit of a stretch for someone at my age. I think of Philip Burrell, the guys that are really experienced. So I'd call myself a specialist on grain storage, but also do a bit of farm business consulting as well. So that's where the economic side really sparks my interest in grain storage and how to make it really fire along for a business and add value to what a farm's already doing.
I think you're being very humble there, Chris. For our listeners, just for a start, can you give a little bit of a background on who you are and how you got into becoming a specialist in grain storage?
Yeah, sure. I always had an interest. So I grew up on a farm just near Horsham in Victoria. I always had an interest in grain storage for some weird reason since I was a little kid. Did a little bit with my dad, invented a product. I was not long out of school to measure the level of grain in a silo, patented that, sold that on, went away to uni. And then my first job after uni was with the Condina Group and got involved with grain storage extension with the Condina Group and have carried that on. And then I've had a bit of a passion for trying to communicate and help farmers make more informed decisions. I think there's so many things that growers need to be across in a production season. So the more I can help with that, and in my case, grain storage is one little component of it. So that's where the passion comes from. That's what I enjoy doing.
It sounds like it comes from a really good place, Chris. I thought for a start we might think about, so I'm a farmer thinking about grain storage. What are the top 3 things that you would recommend I start thinking about first?
Ripper question. Obviously, we're not going to do it if it's not economic. So that's front of mind. We're also not going to get it to be economic if we don't choose the right type of storage for the purpose that we're trying to store grain. So I'd say the first thing is identify how we're going to make money out of it, or how we're going to save money from on-farm storage. Is it harvest logistics that we're chasing? Is it a local market that we're trying to supply, or are we trying to play the market? Seasonal trends? Are we trying to blend quality or trying to clean legumes and lift the grade or segregate on protein? How is it? It might be a combination of those, but the storage that gives us those options, and then figure out whether that type of storage is going to be economic for us. I reckon that's the first thing.
I'm thinking I want to do all those things. I'm like, yep. But maybe starting with harvest logistics. I don't want my trucks held up at the silos for ages. I want to be able to get them coming back and forth to the paddock pretty quickly. But I'd also like to play the market a little bit, Chris. So what are my options for that?
Wouldn't we all like to play the market and get it right every time? Inherently, farmers often referred to as gamblers, so makes sense. And you're spot on, Janine. There's a lot of those examples that we talk about where growers do make good money out of storage. It's because they've been able to string together multiple benefits. Like you say, they've got harvest logistics, they've also played the market, and they've done delivery themselves. They've done freight out of season, so they're not paying peak freight rates at harvest, and they've been maybe utilised their own trucks and labour after the harvest busy rush is gone. So absolutely multiple purposes, multiple benefits of what we're chasing. So frequently you actually find a combination of different storages gives us that flexibility. We have some long-term storage. If we want to play the market over several years, we can fumigate in it. We make it aeration cooling, so we can maintain grain quality over that time. But then when harvest logistics is our main purpose, we've got some more temporary, shorter term storage, our bags, our bunkers, our sheds, the lower capital cost. And if we don't use it every year, it doesn't matter. We haven't outlaid a heap of capital for just the benefit of harvest logistics.
Okay, so all those things sound great. I'm like, yep, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But I've only got a certain amount of money in my budget for next year. So how should I be planning my grain storage? Should I have a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan or a 1-year plan?
That's a great question. How long do you reckon a silo would last?
I don't know. You're the specialist. Hopefully a long time.
That's the question I ask straight back to people when they give me that question. How long do you reckon a silo should last? And I'd take a pick at 30 years. There's examples of much longer, but let's say 30 years for the purpose of the exercise. And silos, unless they're the small transportable ones, they're pretty hard to change. They're not like other bits of equipment that you can start with a cheap one, see if you use it. If you use it a heap, then buy a better quality one. Silos are permanent infrastructure usually, so can't afford to dip our toe in the water and just try it. We've got to get a good quality gas-tight storage first up because it's going to be there for 30 years. So it's a 30-year investment, not a 5-year plan. It's a really long-term plan if permanent infrastructure is what we're looking at getting into. So I would start, to answer your original question, you're going to need a fumigation option at some point. So I'd start there. Make sure you've got some gas-tight sealable storage. Yes, it's going to be probably a higher capital cost, but have that option to fumigate when you need to. From there, then you can open up your scope to, okay, we'll supplement that with a shed, bags, bunkers, the more temporary type storages that are lower cost, but we've got the option to batch fumigate if we need to.
It sounds expensive though.
It's not for me if it's your money.
Yeah, precisely, Chris. So you're saying think about those fixed silos at about 30 years, which helps with the cost of them. But whenever people say that, I think they're expensive. But so how much are they roughly, the fixed ones?
Yeah, look, they vary significantly based on size, quantity, structure, format, and how far you are from the manufacturer and the concrete plants. So more useful, let's start at what's the most expensive typically on $1 per tonne. And often that's the build on site large cone bottoms. So your 300 tonne cone bottom type of
They're the
storage.
self-emptying.
Self-emptying, yeah. They have a good place for people that have already got a heap of 100 tonners, the smaller transportable ones, a little bit cheaper, more often than not, but you get sick of shifting the auger every 100 tonne. So there might be a reason to go for the bit more expensive. We need the cone bottom for pulses. Pulses don't store as well in a flat bottom, get damaged on outloading. So there might be a reason that we've got those higher capital cost silos.
So the transportable ones, how big are they?
Typically up to 120 odd tonne is as big as we can transport in Victoria. In other states, they got a little bit bigger, but the 80 to 120 tonne, your typical size.
And then the self-emptying ones, how big are they?
Often around the 260, 300. There are much larger ones so I differentiate them between a transportable versus a build on site cone bottom. Next cheapest is your flat bottoms, and they start getting cost effective, sort of upwards of 800 tonne, and can go up to thousands of tonnes depending on how much segregation you want. So from there, then you come down in cost outlay to your sheds, then down to your bunkers and bags and pits after that. Obviously a lot less capital cost in those bunkers, bags and pits, but a bit more in variable cost in terms of labour and maintenance and time to inload and outload.
Okay, so you would say if you're thinking about grain storage and to try and get a gas tight one, that would be your option. Think about it over 30 years and if you could, one of these self-emptying big ones.
Potentially. I was just trying to use that as an example of why would people go for the most expensive? Well, sometimes there's a reason for it, a particular reason for going that way, but we wouldn't want all of your storage in that format because it's over-capitalising. You would want an amount of that storage, then you might want an overflow amount in a shed, bunker, pit, flat bottom where you don't need too much segregation. You're just looking for a bit lower capital cost, but still something that you can fumigate quite easily and outload with a reasonable amount of ease.
So what's the price difference between the self-emptying and the flat bottom?
Could be $100 a tonne difference there or more.
Okay. And are they about the same size as the self-emptying?
No, so your self-emptying typically around the 300 odd tonne. As I said, you can get much larger, but that's what people tend to use them for. And then your larger flat bottoms, 800 tonne and upwards.
And are they gas tight? So all these, the flat bottom and the self-emptying and the transportable, are they all gas tight?
Can be, yes. Not every manufacturer is gas tight. They'll all sell you a sealed silo or a sealable silo, but gas tight to the Australian standard 2628 is what we need to insist on so that we have that fumigation option when we need it. And in most cases, you won't pay much, if any, extra to find a manufacturer that will deliver that. Used to be you had to pay a premium to get sealable. That premium we're finding is less the case. It's more about quality is what you're paying for now. There's a misunderstanding of people think you buy a sealed silo to seal it up and keep the insects out. We buy a sealable silo so that we can seal it up to keep the gas in during our fumigation period. The rest of the time it's open and breathing. So some manufacturers will offer you a sealable silo or a sealed silo or a fumigatable or semi-sealed or pretty well sealed, all these different terms. What do they really mean? The term I'd love them to use is gas tight sealable, Australian standard 2628, that it will pass a half-life pressure test. All the other terms don't matter.
Okay, so number one thing, if you're thinking about grain storage, make sure it's gas tight to Australian standards. I was wondering what your thoughts are on one, bunkers, and two, how to set them up so that they're, economically, they're making you money, but also logistically, they're not a nightmare.
Yeah, look, bunkers really have a spot, particularly when our yields are highly fluctuating. So bunkers can be unlimited get as many tarps as you like and put grain under bunker. And in years where you don't have big yields, you haven't got infrastructure sitting there that you're paying interest on, that's not earning you an income. You've got a couple of tarps in the back of the shed, maybe a bit of earthworks that you've used in the past. So low capital cost, a little bit more labour and maintenance. So from that perspective, people that do bunkers well tend to be able to manage people well. A little correlation there. If you can manage people, then you're more likely to be able to make the bunkers, the bags work for you because you can get good people to help you do that because that's what they require, a bit of labour and a bit of equipment to do it properly.
That makes very good sense. Now, you were talking about earthworks, and I'm interested in the economics of the earthworks. So tarps on the bottom, gravel on the bottom, concrete on the bottom. What are your thoughts on that?
Not too fast. The main priority is that we get water running away from it. And again, if it's something you're going to use every year, you'll probably put a bit more effort into it. You can afford to outlay a bit more capital on it. So the important thing is, though, that we keep water running away from it. That's the absolute key to bunkers. It's not a pile of grain in the corner of the paddock with the tarp over it. That's when you hear the disaster stories. It's a planned approach. Okay, here's our bunker site or sites around the farm. Designate it, make sure we've got access to fill so we can build it up a little bit or on a rise where we can keep water running away from it.
Okay, so you're saying bunkers are really good as a temporary solution. What about if you're finding that you're using the bunker every year? How do you then go, let's keep using it because it's cheap versus getting one of these bigger, more permanent?
Yeah, if you're going to use it more regularly, you might then look at investing, okay, we'll grade up some walls, earth walls on our bunker to keep water running away from them more reliably. You may want to put permanent walls in to make clamping the tarp down a bit easier and a bit more secure. If you make it so you can clamp the tarp down properly, then you may even get to the point where you can fumigate in it. Do some monitoring to make sure you're achieving the gas level that you need. But if bunkers are something that you find fit for your business, then you may want to invest a little bit more in setting them up. And comparison to silos, spending a little bit more on bunker walls or a little bit more on earthworks or maybe a ground sheet, still much lower capital outlay than a silo. So don't be scared to spend a bit on it if that's something you're using regularly.
Do you have the price difference between them?
They vary significantly depending on how much earthworks and whether you've got bunker walls at concrete or earth, or it will vary. But you're looking at hundreds of dollars for silos and probably tens of dollars for bunkers.
Okay. All right. So moving on then to grain sheds, how economic are those?
They really become economic if they're multi-purpose. So if they store machinery most of the year round, and then for harvest logistics or the odd big year, machinery gets kicked out into the big blue shed outside, and the shed gets used for grain storage. Or it gets used for fertiliser throughout the year, and then it's cleaned out well enough so we don't get contamination issues, and it's used for grain at harvest and following. So that can work. There is now also a brand of shed we've tested that can be sealed, which is a bit of a game changer for sheds. For the first time, we could possibly seal a shed and fumigate in it. Something to be aware of with sheds, if people go and get quotes on a 5,000 tonne shed and they work it back to $1 per tonne basis to compare to silos, that shed is typically only one segregation. So you need 5,000 tonne of the same seg of grain, make use of it. If you only half fill the shed every time you use it for grain, cost on $1 per tonne basis is effectively doubled because you've only half filled it. Whereas a silo, if you've got a silo that you will fill every year, the cost is distributed among the capacity of the silo, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. So potentially the same issue then as the flat bottom silo. So you would just have to have the one segregation. However, you have the added benefit in the flat bottom that if you've bought a gas tight one, that it can be gas tight unless you bought one of these new sheds.
And you could have 5 silos at 1,000 tonne each, flat bottoms. So you've got 5 segs. Could be fumigating 1 or 2 of them and outloading a few of them at the same time. You've got flexibility there, but the same volume of storage, 5,000 tonne in one shed, might be cheaper on a capital outlay basis, but you've got no segregation. If you do want to set up to fumigate that shed, the whole lot is under fumigation at once. Or if you only half fill the shed and then figure out you actually need a different segregation, you're underutilising half your storage capacity.
Not so fun as the gamble, is it? It's not so fun as playing the market because you're actually more restricted than perhaps if you just had the smaller silos or just went straight to delivery.
Correct. Or in your case, went to a bunker. You can pull another tarp out of the shed and start another bunker if you want a segregation, or you want to have one bunker under fumigation while you outload from another one. Again, I come back to the combination works really well. In those periods at harvest when it's rainstorm coming, the wind's starting to come up, we're trying to get the last bit of harvest in. We don't want to be worried about bunker tarps and staff outside, so we whack it in a shed or in a silo where it's safe and secure. We've got time to do that.
Yeah, okay. So just to go back and revise that, you're saying lots of different storage options are probably best. Think about the gas tight. Bunkers can be your friend. Anything can be your friend as long as you know what their limitations are.
Correct. Absolutely. You've nailed there's the key point, Janine, for the end of the podcast. Know the limitation of the storage that you're choosing. And I don't know, maybe stretching beyond my expertise here, but I reckon there's a little bit of people's personality comes into it, in that if you're a really diligent operator and great with people, you're more likely to do a good job with things like bags and bunkers and get great success with them. If you're one of these people that are always time poor, there's 15 jobs to do, staff are coming and going, by the time you get trained, they leave. Silos that are simple and easy to operate, they may actually be suited to your operation more than something that requires more labour.
That is such a key point, isn't it? Because communication and organisation in harvest is imperative because there's not a lot that you can control, really. There's so many variables. So the things that you can control, such as grain storage, if you've got those managed correctly, then it's just going to make everything else a lot easier. But yeah, know your personality type and how much you've got on your plate, I think is such a good point. We haven't spoken much about grain bags, Chris. So what are your thoughts on those?
Compliant chemical storage sheds are important infrastructure for cropping enterprises from a safety point of view and for sustainability certification. BCG Gold sponsors, Action, the Big Shed People, have developed a range of standard chemical shed designs to help you meet these requirements. Designs include details such as lock-up storage areas, bunded concrete floors, ventilation and sprayer bays. Head to actionsteel.com.au to learn more about the designs, sizes and prices.
I reckon grain bags have got a place. And as you said, know the limitations of the storage and also know the limitations of how much work and effort you've gone when you set the grain bag up. If you've just chucked a bag at the end of the run in the paddock, expect to have to pick it up again in 3 months, unless you want to run the risk of damage and trouble accessing and mice holes and water ingress. If you want bags to last longer, centralise them around the farm. Pick some good spots with all-weather access or closer to all-weather access, on a rise, on a slope to keep water running away from vermin, somewhere that you're going to drive past and monitor more regularly. We're more likely to monitor 3 or 4 points around the farm where our bag sites are than 30 or 40 bags scattered around the farm. So centralising them, fence them off, bait them, do all that sort of stuff, and they can last a whole lot longer than scattered through every paddock.
That's a really interesting point, I think, because when I think of grain bags and the logistics of harvest, I think I would just bring the bagger to the paddock and just bag that paddock and bag the next paddock. So what you're saying, though, is that you might still have to move your grain back to that central point anyway. So they're not looking as attractive to me.
Yeah, and again, comes back to why are we doing it? Is it just harvest logistics and we're going to unload the bag a couple of weeks after harvest? No problem. Just put them along the end of the paddock. But be realistic. If you haven't put a lot of effort into their setup, you may get issues with them in less time than if you had to put them in a centralised site. So if you want the option to help with harvest logistics and play the market and store them for a longer period, do that little bit extra work at harvest, cart them a little bit further, whether that's get a second chaser bin in and just ferry it with a chaser bin or truck it back to a centralised site. I know that's the last thing people want to do at harvest, but if you want the added option of maybe I want to store this off-spec grain a bit longer until I can figure out what to do with it, I'll choose to truck that back to a central site.
Okay, so what is the price difference between bunkers and grain bags?
I think you'll find they're reasonably similar, but they probably offer different advantages and disadvantages. Your bags you'll have a lot more segregation with, but it depends how you're set up to operate too. They will end up a little bit more expensive than bunkers. Bunkers are much better for high volume, less segregation. They'll be a little bit cheaper.
So how much are the bags?
Good question. So I'm looking through the grain storage grow notes at the economics section, and that's got some example pricing in there, but it's always worth checking with your local suppliers. As an example of bags, so if a bag costs $1,300 and it's quoted to store 240 tonne, you're looking at $5.40 per tonne roughly, plus your inloader and outloader. If you've purchased them outright, then it depends how many tonnes you can put through it in a year and how long you expect it to last versus hiring the inloader and outloader. Yeah, and that depends on demand on the year usually.
Are they expensive to buy outright?
Everything's expensive to buy outright in my view these days. So you'd certainly want to utilise them. Sometimes people will choose to buy an inloader because everyone needs them at the same time and then share an outloader with a few neighbours or in a district because you can usually have some more influence over when you outload a bag. But if you want to be putting grain in a bag, everyone wants it at the same time.
That's a good point. So share the outloader, maybe have the inloader yourself. So it's temporary storage, but you still have to outlay costs for these inloader and the outloader. I didn't think about that.
Correct. Same as bunker. You've got to buy a decent auger to be able to build a bunker stack and then have some way to outload it, whether that's a large telehandler or a loader or an auger set up to do it. You still need some infrastructure, which needs to be included in the economic calculations of storage. In the same way that if you're buying new silos and your old auger doesn't reach to the top of the silo, or at some point you'll need to replace it. So include the cost of an auger. And while you're doing it, have a look at, here's one for you that's a little different. Sometimes if you can get the same amount of grain in less silos, you may need a bigger auger to reach than what you've already got, but the saving in the storage pays for buying the extra auger.
Going back to that first question, Chris, so say I've got a few quotes for a few different things. I'm thinking about getting a new silo. Is it as simple as just getting the cheapest silo, or are there some other things that I need to consider?
I'd look at, obviously, we've talked about gas tight already. That's your number one. If you're not going to guarantee that in the contract, cross the manufacturer off the list. Then look at value for money as to what they're actually quoting. They'll often quote in a dollar per tonne or a whole figure, but you convert back to dollar per tonne. Just make sure the volumetric measure they're using is comparable. Some manufacturers will use a high grain weight, others will use a low grain weight. So the actual tonnes you get in their storage can vary. So just check that you're comparing like with like there. And then look at what's included in the quote, whether each quote includes transport to your place, groundworks, concrete, who's doing the slab or the pad. Does it include aeration systems, controllers, power to site or no power? Just being on what it includes and what it doesn't. And then things like ladders or access to the top. At some point, we're going to need to do maintenance and monitoring of the grain in storage, so we'll need a safe way to access the top. I know ladders cost extra, but no one I've spoken to regrets having ready access to the top of a silo. Figuring out how to do that cost effectively is worth looking at.
Okay, so I've got three things that I wanted to ask you about. First, so what grain weight do you recommend?
I'm not too concerned about what they use as long as they're using something consistent across each manufacturer.
Oh, okay, yeah, because otherwise you're not comparing apples with apples. I understand that. My second question was the economics of aeration systems. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, good question. I think if you're looking at aeration only as an alternative to fumigating, the economics won't stack up. Phosphenes, we've got sealable storage, phosphenes 40 or 50 cents a tonne. We're not going to get much cheaper than that. But if we're looking at aeration cooling to retrofit to storage that's not gas tight, phosphine wasn't an option there anyway, so don't compare it to phosphine. If we're looking at aeration cooling for all its other benefits, as well as preventing having to fumigate so often, then it starts becoming economic. So we're using aeration to grain quality. We're using it to vent phosphine. When we do have to fumigate, we can significantly reduce our vent time. We can hold some grain that's a little bit over moisture. We can blend moisture. So there's other benefits of aeration cooling. Then the economics start stacking up really well. Often people get aeration cooling, look at the first electricity bill and go, hang on, Chris, this economics of aeration's not stacking up. When they just look at the sum of their bill, and then they look at how many tonnes of grain have we actually cooled with that first bill. Work it back on $1 per tonne, and you'll figure out it's less than $1 a tonne to cool the grain down. So typically you're looking at sort of 50 cents a tonne for the first month, and then maybe around 20 cents a tonne per month after that to cool grain down. That's the electricity cost.
Wow, that was a really big answer. My brain was just going, so many, what about this? What about this? So I'm going to try and remember all the things that I was thinking. So you started by saying it's not going to stack up. So gas tight versus aeration cooling, the figures aren't going to stack up, and you're going to want to go with the gas tight because of that economics. But then you went on to say that there's all these other benefits to aeration cooling. So you might want to think about that. And then you also talked about the electricity cost. So that's like another cost on top of the actual system itself. So in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, sounds like this aeration cooling is going to be quite expensive. However, you talked about getting the temperature down. You talked about what were the other couple of things you said?
So we're preventing mould and insects or trying to deter them. We're managing moisture with aeration cooling. We're managing grain quality, so seed colour in pulses in particular, and germination in seed grain.
And the other thing I remembered from one of your presentations is that keeping the temperature of the grain down also helps with the weevils, doesn't it? They breed a lot as it gets hotter.
Correct. They love warm conditions for breeding. So I'll help trying to put it in perspective here. A lot of us at harvest, when pressure's on and we're trying to get more harvest hours in a day, more grain in per day, if we're limited by a grain moisture, we go and look at, I'll get a contract harvester in, or I'll buy a bigger header next year. I'll go to a second or a third header next year. If we could manage moisture in grain, do it with less headers because we get more hours in a day. So we can start harvest a few hours earlier or run it a few hours later, or those overcast days where the moisture is just sitting a percent above our deliverable. What if we could run our headers on those days and not have as much capital tied up in harvest equipment, and actually use aeration cooling to blend moisture in storage? So then all of a sudden we get grain storage paying itself with harvest logistics, actually managing moisture. So our harvesters are running more hours of the day or more days. We can play the market still if we want to. We can blend on quality. We might be able to clean the grain. We can potentially use our own trucks after harvest to freight it straight to port. That's when we start getting the economics of on-farm storage to stack up.
So how far can you push the moisture then with the aeration cooling?
So we're not trying to dry the grain with aeration cooling. We're just trying to hold it, stop it from heating and sweating until we've got some dry grain to blend it with.
So the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, Chris, was I saw another silo collapse on the news recently, and you do hear of them. I don't want to be investing a lot of money into a silo and then it collapses. What are the economics of maintenance? How do I know when that silo's life is over?
Good question. I reckon it starts at the purchase. And again, if we're price focused at the purchase point and we're tossing up between a couple $100 for on 100,000, that's based on just on price, we might overlook quality of what we're actually getting. So ask manufacturers, what engineering standards are they built to? What are they designed to withstand? Making sure we're actually getting value for money. Then in terms of existing silos, obviously make sure we're only ever filling empty from the centre point. We don't want side loading on them. And as part of the annual maintenance, when you're looking at replacing seals, have a look at the quality of the silo. If we've got corrosion on rivets and bolts, if we've got the slabs moved so it's not sitting vertically anymore, or the slab's compromised so it's loading the legs unevenly, those sorts of things. If it's had some structural damage, someone's run into it and dented a leg or dented the side of the silo, they really do rely on spreading the load evenly around the structure. So if that's compromised in any way, we may need to repair it or even decommission it if it's beyond repair. And certainly modifying is one I've seen occasionally, where people will cut legs out to fit the shifter in a bit easier, thinking they'll come back and weld a leg in or brace it or something, and never got back to it. And well, it lasted last year. It didn't fall over, so I won't bother. But then you get a bit of slab movement, or you put a fertilizer in it, or a lentil, or a heavier grain, and characteristics are a bit different, and then the silo falls over. So
okay, you mentioned ladders before, Chris. I thought that we were moving away from ladders. I thought that's what the sight glasses and things were for. Why are you encouraging ladders?
I'm encouraging ladders because I've seen a lot of people buy silos without ladders, and within about 12 months they ring me up and say, Chris, so I've bought some silos. Didn't get ladders because they're expensive and not supposed to climb silos anymore. But the cockie's chewed the seal on the lid. How do I replace that? How do I know when to fumigate? If you can't get to the top of the silo and look for insects, you don't know when to fumigate. Or they might, well, how do I get a sample of grain from the top? Because what I put in the top was a different day from what I put in the bottom. I've lost my sample bucket and I need another sample of grain. Or I need to repair a lid that I bumped with the auger at harvest time. How do I repair that lid? Whether it's a ladder or an elevated walkway or a safe boom lift, or be realistic, we need a safe way to get to the top of storage.
So was there anything else, Chris, that you thought might be important for listeners to know, particularly around this time of year?
I'm worried that I've opened a lot of cans for people and not closed many, but hopefully open the thinking around it's not just about dollars and cents. It's about what does those dollars and cents enable me to do with my storage. Do your research, and do your research with a multitude of sources. So don't just do your research from two neighbours. Go and have a look in a different state, see how they do it over there. Look at the JDC information references. Go and talk to a few different manufacturers. Have a variety of sources. If you're going to talk to neighbours about grain storage, pick a neighbour that's got different types of storages, not a line of 80 silos of all the exact same size, because they probably couldn't be bothered doing much research. Go and talk to the neighbour that's got 3 different brands, some flat bottoms, some cone bottoms, some sheds, does some bags, and learn how they utilise each type of storage. They'll be a good source of information.
Do you have any videos on people like that people can click on the links to, Chris?
Yeah, there's some good stories from growers we've done just this year, case studies of growers that are utilising storage well. There's also a research report that we partner with the Condina Group on, particularly for temporary storages, so bags, bunkers, sheds, pits. That's a really good reference on the stored grain website as well. If anyone does have questions, they can call one of the team on 1-800-Weevil. It's the growers' levies through the GRDC that pay us to answer that phone. More than happy to help out and have these discussions. Would much prefer to have the discussion around grain storage before the investment than after the money's been spent and found out that it could have been done better. So 1-800-Weevil will put you in contact with your nearest grain storage specialist.
If you love the podcast and would like to show your support, please rate us 5 stars wherever you listen to your podcasts and share it with your friends. We'll catch you again soon.
BCG drives the prosperity of Australian farmers, communities and landscapes through applied research, innovation and events. To find out more about what we're up to, our team and events near you, visit bcg.org.au. BCG acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present.